#the last rain of spring Montana Territory, 1878. The skies over Copper Gulch broke open like a dark promise finally kept, bringing forth the season's first truly violent storm. Griffin Novak squinted through sheets of rain as lightning painted the distant mountains in stark white flashes. Something moved on the horizon, a buggy, tilting dangerously in the gale. "Damn fools," he muttered, though his horse was already turning, responding to the subtle pressure of his knees. Nobody with sense traveled these parts in weather like this. The wind carried the sounds of panic to him, a woman's voice, high and desperate, fighting against the storm's fury. Griffin dug his heels in, sending his stallion charging toward the listing carriage just as its wheel caught in a washout, tipping it precariously. When he reached the vehicle, he found a young woman in a rain-soaked traveling dress frantically, trying to calm a pair of terrified horses as water rushed beneath the carriage wheels. "Ma'am," he called over the wind, "you need to abandon that rig before it goes over." Her wide eyes met his, fear and determination warring in her expression. "My belongings will be gone same as you if you don't move now," he shouted back. Lightning cracked overhead, and the horses reared. The woman screamed as the carriage tilted further, sliding toward the newly formed gully. Griffin didn't wait for permission. He leaned from his saddle, caught her around the waist, and hauled her bodily onto his horse just as the carriage tipped completely. The woman clutched at him, trembling with cold and terror as they watched her conveyance tumble into the rapidly filling ravine, her possessions scattering like fallen leaves. "Hold tight," he instructed, turning his mount toward home. The woman pressed against his back, her face buried between his shoulder blades as rain pounded them mercilessly. Griffin felt her shivering intensify and urged his horse faster. His cabin was still 4 miles out, and hypothermia was as dangerous as any gun in these parts. "Name's Griffin Novak," he called over his shoulder. "Theodora Ellis," she replied, voice barely audible through chattering teeth. "I was bound for Silver Creek." "You're about 15 miles off course, Miss Ellis. Road washed out last week." He felt her slump against him, consciousness wavering. "Stay awake now. Tell me why a lady's traveling alone to Silver Creek." "Teaching position," she mumbled. "New schoolhouse." Griffin nodded, though worry creased his brow. He'd seen strong men succumb to exposure in less time than it would take to reach his cabin. "Keep talking," he urged. "Everything I own," she whispered. "In that carriage." "We'll worry about that tomorrow," he said firmly. "Right now, you just stay with me." The lights of his cabin appeared through the rain-blurred darkness like distant stars. Griffin had never been so grateful for the sight of his humble home. He'd built it with his own hands after the war, seeking solitude from a world that no longer made sense. Now, for the first time in years, he was bringing someone into his private sanctuary. By the time they reached the cabin, Theodora was barely conscious. Griffin lifted her from the saddle and carried her inside, kicking the door shut against the howling wind. He laid her on the bearskin rug before the fireplace and quickly stoked the banked coals into fresh flames. "Miss Ellis," he said, gently patting her cheek. "Theodora, you need to get out of those wet clothes." Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused. "Cold," was all she managed. Griffin's hands hesitated at the buttons of her sodden jacket. He was no stranger to survival necessities, but undressing an unconscious woman went against every principle his mother had instilled in him. "Miss Ellis, I'm going to help you out of these wet things and wrap you in blankets. It's medical, nothing more." When she didn't respond, he added, "I'll be respectful, but you'll die in these clothes." He worked quickly, averting his eyes as much as possible while removing her outer garments, leaving her in her soaked chemise and petticoat. He wrapped her in his thickest wool blanket and pulled her closer to the fire. Only then did he attend to his own dripping clothes, changing swiftly before returning to her side. Griffin pressed a cup of whiskey to her blue-tinged lips. "Drink," he commanded. "It'll warm you from inside." She sputtered at the first sip, but managed to swallow. Color gradually returned to her face as the fire and whiskey did their work. "Thank you," she whispered, eyes more lucid now. "You saved my life." "Anyone would have done the same," he replied gruffly. Her gaze took in his Spartan cabin, the single chair, the narrow bed, the lack of any decorative touches. "You live alone." It wasn't a question, but he answered anyway. 7 years now. "Since the war?" she asked, surprising him with her perception. Griffin nodded once, uncomfortable with how quickly she'd read him. Rest now. We'll figure things out in the morning. As he settled into his chair for what promised to be a long night, Griffin couldn't help wondering what twist of fate had sent this woman across his path. He'd chosen isolation deliberately after Shiloh and the horrors that followed. Now a half-drowned schoolteacher had invaded his carefully constructed solitude, and something told him his life would never be quite the same. Morning brought watery sunshine and the full impact of Theodora's situation. Standing in Griffin's too large spare shirt and trousers, she gazed out the window at the mud-choked landscape, her expression veering between resignation and despair. Everything, she repeated, more to herself than to him. My books, my teaching certificates, my letters of recommendation, even my mother's locket. Griffin set a plate of beans and cornbread before her. Eat. We'll ride out after and see what we can salvage. Why are you helping me? She asked suddenly. You clearly prefer solitude. His jaw tightened. Just because a man chooses to live alone doesn't mean he's forgotten decency. I didn't mean, eat your breakfast, Miss Ellis. They rode double on Griffin's horse to the site of the accident. The carriage lay on its side in the ravine, partially submerged in muddy water. Most of her trunks had burst open, their contents scattered across a quarter-mile of suddenly transformed landscape. Theodora slid from the horse before Griffin could help her down and waded into the muck. For 2 hours, they salvaged what they could: sodden books, a few articles of clothing, a waterlogged journal. Her teaching credentials were found plastered against a rock, the ink running but still legible. My mother's locket, she said repeatedly, searching frantically. Silver, with roses engraved on the front. Griffin watched her determination with growing respect. She hadn't broken down once, despite losing nearly everything she owned. Instead, she worked methodically, saving what could be saved and accepting what was lost. When the sun reached its zenith, he called, Miss Ellis, we should head back. Just a little longer, she pleaded, pushing her hair from her face with a mud-streaked hand. Griffin dismounted and joined her search, combing through debris until a glint of metal caught his eye. There, half buried in silt, lay a tarnished silver locket. He carefully extracted it and cleaned it against his shirt. Is this what you're looking for? Theodora's face transformed as she took the necklace from his palm. Yes. Oh, thank God. She clutched it to her chest, tears finally spilling over. It's all I have left of her. Something in Griffin's chest twisted at the raw emotion in her voice. He awkwardly patted her shoulder and used to offering comfort. We found what matters. The rest is just things. Back at the cabin, Theodora washed her salvaged clothing and hung it to dry while Griffin rode to his nearest neighbor, old Elijah Porter, to send word to Silver Creek about her delay. She can stay with Martha and me, Elijah offered when Griffin explained the situation. Wouldn't be proper, her staying alone with you. Griffin bristled. I gave her my bed and slept in the chair. No doubt, son, Elijah said mildly. But folks'll talk all the same. Let them, Griffin replied tersely. She needs rest before traveling again. When he returned, he found Theodora had transformed his Spartan cabin. His few dishes were arranged neatly on newly wiped shelves. A bouquet of wildflowers stood in a tin cup on his table, and something savory bubbled in his cookpot. I hope you don't mind, she said, noticing his surprise. I wanted to repay your kindness. You didn't have to do all this. I know. She smiled tentatively. But I wanted to. That evening, they shared a meal better than any Griffin had eaten in years. Theodora had somehow created a flavorful stew from his basic provisions, and the companionable silence as they ate felt strangely comfortable. Tell me about Silver Creek, Griffin said finally. What brings a lady like you all the way out here for a teaching position? A shadow crossed her face. I needed a fresh start. My father died last year, and the bank took our home in Boston. Teaching was the only respectable option available to me. No husband, family to take you in. No husband, she confirmed. And my remaining relatives made it clear I was an unwelcome burden. Griffin nodded, understanding all too well how quickly one could become unwanted. Silver Creek's growing. Decent folks, mostly. They've been wanting a proper school for their children. And you? She asked. What brought you to this solitary place? He stared into his coffee. The war. Saw things no man should see. Did things no man should have to do. And solitude helps. Used to think so. He met her gaze directly. Now I'm not so certain. Thunder rumbled in the distance, hinting at another approaching storm. Theodora's hand trembled slightly as she set down her cup. Will the road to Silver Creek be passable soon? She asked. Not for a few days at least, Griffin replied, noting her nervousness. You afraid of storms? After yesterday? Wouldn't you be? He smiled faintly. Fair point. Lightning flashed, illuminating her delicate profile. Griffin found himself studying her features, the determined set of her jaw, the intelligence in her eyes, the way her dark hair curled as it dried. She was lovely in an understated way that snuck up on a person. I should turn in, she said, rising. You've been more than generous with your bed. Take it again tonight, he insisted. I'm used to sleeping rough. She hesitated, then said softly, Thank you, Mr. Novak, for everything. Long after she'd retired, Griffin sat watching the fire, unsettled by the emotions this unexpected visitor had stirred. He'd built walls around himself since returning from the war, walls as solid as those of his cabin. Yet somehow, this woman had walked through them as easily as she'd walked through his door. The storm raged through the night, wind howling around the cabin's corners like restless spirits. Griffin dozed fitfully in his chair until a cry from the bed jolted him awake. Theodora was sitting upright, eyes wide with terror, her hands clutching the blankets. The water, she gasped. It was pulling me under. Without thinking, Griffin moved to her side, taking her trembling hands in his. Just a nightmare. You're safe here. She looked up at him, vulnerability naked on her face. I keep seeing that carriage tipping, feeling the horses panic. If you hadn't come along. But I did, he said firmly. And you're here, safe and sound. Their eyes held, something unspoken passing between them. For a disorienting moment, Griffin thought she might draw him closer, and more surprising still, he realized he wanted her to. Instead, she slowly withdrew her hands. I've never been so afraid, she admitted. Yet here I am, alive because of a stranger's kindness. Not much of a stranger anymore, he pointed out. Her smile was soft in the firelight. No, I suppose not. As she settled back against the pillows, Griffin returned to his chair, acutely aware of how his solitary existence had been upended in less than 24 hours. More unsettling was the realization that he didn't mind nearly as much as he should. 3 days passed with Theodora Ellis in Griffin Novak's cabin. 3 days of gradually clearing skies and slowly drying roads. 3 days in which his orderly, isolated life transformed into something warmer and more vibrant than he'd known since before the war. Theodora proved herself resourceful and determined. She mended her salvaged clothes with neat, precise stitches. She reorganized his meager pantry and stretched his provisions into meals that reminded him of home. Most surprisingly, she drew him into conversation about books he'd read, places he'd seen, even memories of his life before the fighting began. On the morning of the 4th day, Griffin rode out at dawn and returned with a horse he'd borrowed from Elijah Porter. Road to Silver Creek should be passable now, he announced, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his chest. I can escort you there today. Theodora looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her expression unreadable. Oh, I see. Unless you'd prefer another day of rest, he added quickly. She shook her head. No, I should go. They'll be expecting me, and I've imposed on your hospitality long enough. It's been no imposition, Griffin said, the words emerging more intensely than he'd intended. Their eyes met across the small cabin, and for a moment, the air between them seemed charged with unspoken possibilities. Then Theodora looked away, dusting flour from her hands. I'll pack my things. They rode out mid-morning, Griffin on his stallion and Theodora on Elijah's gentle mare. The landscape bore the scars of the recent storms. Uprooted trees, washed-out sections of trail, new gullies carved into familiar terrain. They traveled slowly, Griffin carefully guiding them around hazards. It's beautiful country, Theodora observed as they crossed a ridge overlooking the valley. Wilder than I expected. Takes some getting used to, Griffin agreed. But once it gets in your blood, nowhere else feels right. Is that why you stay? Despite the solitude. He considered her question. Partly. Also because people here don't ask too many questions about a man's past. And if someone did ask, she ventured. Griffin's jaw tightened. Most don't make that mistake twice. They rode in silence for a while after that. each lost in private thoughts until they crested a hill and Silver Creek came into view. The town was smaller than Theodora had imagined. A single main street with perhaps 20 buildings, the new schoolhouse standing apart near the edge of town. "It's tiny," she murmured, anxiety evident in her voice. "Small but growing," Griffin reassured her. "Good folks, mostly. They've been saving for that schoolhouse for 3 years." As they approached the town limits, Griffin felt a strange reluctance settling over him. For 4 days, Theodora Ellis had brought light and conversation into his solitary existence. Now he would deliver her to her new life and return to his empty cabin. The townspeople noticed their arrival immediately. Faces appeared in shop windows, and several men stepped out onto the boardwalk, watching curiously as Griffin escorted the new schoolteacher down the main street. Mayor Thomas Whitfield hurried from his office to greet them, his portly frame and bushy sideburns giving him an official air. "Miss Ellis, we'd nearly given up hope. When we didn't hear from you as scheduled, we feared the worst. I encountered difficulties on the road," Theodora explained, sliding gracefully from her borrowed mount. "Mr. Novak rescued me during the storm and has kindly escorted me to town." The mayor's eyebrows rose as he took in Griffin's presence. "Novak? Well, this is unexpected. We're much obliged to you, sir." Griffin nodded stiffly, uncomfortable with the attention. "Just happened to be in the right place. Nevertheless, you have our thanks." Whitfield turned back to Theodora. "Miss Ellis, we've prepared lodgings for you with Mrs. Gardner, our seamstress. She's a widow with a spare room and will be delighted to finally meet you." Theodora glanced at Griffin, something like regret in her eyes. "Mr. Novak has been extraordinarily kind. I lost most of my possessions in the storm, but he helped me salvage what he could. We'll see you properly outfitted," the mayor assured her. "Silver Creek takes care of its own, and you're one of us now." Griffin dismounted, suddenly eager to be away from the curious stares. "I should head back before dark. You won't stay for supper?" Mayor Whitfield asked. "Mrs. Whitfield would be pleased to thank you properly for delivering our teacher safely." "Another time, perhaps," Griffin declined, already backing toward his horse. Theodora stepped forward, her hand outstretched. "Mr. Novak, I cannot adequately express my gratitude." He took her hand briefly, acutely aware of the watching townsfolk. "No need, Miss Ellis. Just doing what anyone would." "Not anyone," she said softly. "Goodbye, Griffin." He nodded once, sharply, then mounted his horse and turned away, feeling her eyes on his back as he rode out of Silver Creek. Only when the town disappeared behind him did he acknowledge the hollow feeling in his chest. Griffin returned to his cabin and the silence that had once felt like peace. Now it merely seemed empty. He moved through his evening routine mechanically, tending his horse, preparing a simple meal, banking the fire for the night. Everything was exactly as it had been before the storm, yet nothing felt the same. Theodora's presence lingered in the small touches she'd left behind. The organized shelves, the neatly folded blankets, a forgotten handkerchief tucked beside the bed. Griffin picked it up, rubbing the delicate fabric between his calloused fingers. It carried the faint scent of lavender, so incongruous in his rustic dwelling. In 4 days, she had transformed more than just his living space. She had reminded him what human connection felt like, what it meant to care for someone beyond mere duty or obligation. Now she was gone, and he was left with an awareness of his isolation that felt sharper than before. "Damn fool," he muttered to himself, shoving the handkerchief into his pocket. "She's where she belongs." The next morning, Griffin threw himself into work with singular focus. He repaired storm damage to his small corral, chopped enough firewood for a month, and hunted a deer to replenish his meat stores. Physical exhaustion, he reasoned, would drive out unwelcome thoughts. A week passed this way. Then 2. Griffin avoided trips to town, sending word with Elijah Porter when he needed supplies. He told himself it was simply a return to his normal habits, not an avoidance of Silver Creek and its new schoolteacher. On the 17th day after leaving Theodora in town, Griffin was startled by the sound of approaching hoofbeats. Visitors were rare at his isolated cabin. He stepped outside, rifle ready, only to find Elijah Porter's youngest son, Timothy, riding up on a lathered horse. "Mr. Novak," the boy called, breathless with excitement. "Pa sent me to fetch you. There's trouble in town." Griffin's heart quickened. "What kind of trouble?" "It's Miss Ellis, the schoolteacher." Timothy's eyes were wide. Some men came to town, saying she ain't who she claims. They're fixing to take her back east to stand trial. Trial? For what? Don't rightly know, the boy admitted. But Pa said to tell you she's asking for you. Griffin was already striding toward his stable. Tell your father I'm on my way. He rode hard for Silver Creek, mind racing with possibilities. Who was Theodora Ellis really? What could she possibly have done to warrant arrest? The woman he'd sheltered had seemed forthright and honest, yet clearly, there were secrets she hadn't shared. Silver Creek was in an uproar when he arrived. A crowd had gathered outside the schoolhouse, where raised voices could be heard. Griffin dismounted and pushed his way through the throng, hand resting on his pistol. Inside, he found Theodora standing tall before her desk, facing down two men in expensive Eastern suits. Mayor Whitfield and several town council members stood to one side, expressions troubled. Absolutely no legal right, Theodora was saying, her voice steady despite her pale complexion. Those papers were legally executed and notarized. Executed under false pretenses, one man retorted. When my client discovers your true identity, Miss Ellis, Griffin interrupted, stepping forward. All eyes turned to him, including Theodora's, which widened with relief. Mr. Novak, she breathed. Thank you for coming. The taller of the two men assessed Griffin with cold eyes. This doesn't concern you, sir. When you threaten a lady in my territory, it concerns me, Griffin replied evenly. Who are you, and what do you want with Miss Ellis? The man straightened his waistcoat. Lawrence Chamberlain, attorney representing the estate of Edmund Ellis of Boston. This woman is wanted for theft and fraud. That's a lie, Theodora countered. My father left everything to me legally. It was Mr. Chamberlain's client, my cousin Richard, who attempted fraud by contesting the will after I'd already left Boston. Griffin moved to stand beside her. Let me understand this. You're claiming Miss Ellis stole her own inheritance. She absconded with valuable family heirlooms and documents before the will could be properly reviewed. The second man interjected. We have a warrant for her arrest from Massachusetts, which holds no jurisdiction in Montana territory, Mayor Whitfield noted. Miss Ellis has been nothing but an asset to our community these past weeks. Chamberlain smiled thinly. Nevertheless, we intend to escort her back to Boston to face these charges. Unless, of course, she's willing to sign over her claim to the Ellis estate and return the items in question. Griffin saw the trap immediately. This isn't about justice. It's about intimidation. My cousin sent them because he knows he has no legal claim, Theodora explained, her voice tight with anger. My father's will was properly executed. Richard simply believes that as a woman alone, I can be bullied into submission. He calculated wrong, Griffin said softly, for her ears alone. Chamberlain stepped forward. Miss Ellis, be reasonable. A lengthy court battle will only deplete whatever resources you have left. Sign the documents we've prepared, return your father's pocket watch and signet ring, and you can remain here with your rustic new life. Theodora's spine straightened. Those items were explicitly left to me in my father's will, along with the house that Richard has already illegally occupied. I will not be intimidated by my cousin's hired thugs. Then I'm afraid we must insist you return with us, Chamberlain said coldly. Griffin's hand moved to his pistol. The lady isn't going anywhere against her will. Tension crackled in the schoolroom as the two Eastern lawyers assessed the determined frontiersman. Mayor Whitfield cleared his throat nervously. Perhaps we should adjourn to my office and discuss this civilly, he suggested. An excellent idea, Chamberlain agreed smoothly. Miss Ellis, shall we? We shall not, she replied firmly. I have a class to teach. My students will be arriving shortly. This matter takes precedence over. Nothing takes precedence over these children's education, she interrupted. If you wish to continue this discussion, it will have to wait until after school hours. Griffin suppressed a smile at her composure. I'll escort these gentlemen to the hotel, Mayor. Ensure they're comfortable while they wait. Chamberlain's face darkened. We are not accustomed to being dismissed. Welcome to Montana, Griffin replied, gesturing toward the door. Different customs out here. Ladies and school children come first. As children began filtering into the schoolhouse, the lawyers had no choice but to withdraw. Griffin escorted them outside, then turned back to Theodora. I'll be nearby all day, he promised quietly. They won't get near you alone. Gratitude shone in her eyes. I never wanted to bring trouble to Silver Creek. Or to you. Trouble has a way of finding me regardless, he said with a half-smile. We'll sort this out. True to his word, Griffin positioned himself outside the schoolhouse throughout the day, whittling a piece of pine while keeping a watchful eye on the lawyers, who remained at the hotel. When school dismissed, he entered the classroom to find Theodora gathering her things, tension evident in her movements. They'll be back, she said without preamble, and they won't leave without what they came for. Then give me the full story, Griffin requested. I can't help if I don't know what we're facing. Theodora sank into her chair, suddenly looking exhausted. My father was a successful merchant in Boston. When he died last year, he left everything to me. The house, his business interests, family heirlooms. My cousin Richard contested the will, claiming father wasn't of sound mind when he executed it. And was he? Of sound mind. Completely, she affirmed. The doctor testified to it. But Richard has connections in Boston society that I lack. When it became clear the courts might favor him despite the evidence, I decided to accept this teaching position and start fresh. With your inheritance, Griffin noted. Only what was rightfully mine, my mother's jewelry, my father's watch and signet ring. Personal items with sentimental value, but limited monetary worth. She looked up at him earnestly. I didn't steal anything, Griffin. I simply took what was already legally mine before Richard could claim it all. Griffin studied her face, finding only sincerity. I believe you. Relief washed over her features. You're the first person who has, without question. I've spent enough time with you to know you're not a thief. He leaned against her desk. But those men won't leave empty-handed. No, she agreed. They'll try to force me back to Boston, where Richard's influence can ensure I lose everything. Griffin considered their options. The territorial courts might recognize your claim, but legal battles take time and money. Both of which I lack, Theodora said ruefully. There might be another way, Griffin said slowly, an idea taking shape. But you'd have to trust me completely. Before he could elaborate, the schoolhouse door opened, and Mayor Whitfield entered with Chamberlain and his associate. Miss Ellis, the mayor began awkwardly. These gentlemen are most insistent about resolving this matter today. Chamberlain stepped forward, a document case in hand. We've prepared the necessary papers. Sign them, return the items in question, and this unpleasantness ends immediately. And if I refuse? Theodora challenged. Then we'll be forced to pursue more aggressive measures. Chamberlain's smile didn't reach his eyes. Sheriff Tanner in Silver City has already agreed to hold you until arrangements can be made for your return to Massachusetts. Griffin moved protectively closer to Theodora. On what grounds? You admitted yourself your warrant holds no jurisdiction here. Fugitives from justice can be detained pending proper extradition, the second lawyer supplied smugly. This is absurd, Griffin growled. She's no fugitive. Theodora touched his arm gently. It's all right, Griffin. To Chamberlain, she said, I need time to consider your offer. You have until morning, Chamberlain replied. We'll expect your answer and the items at 9 o'clock. After they departed, Theodora released a shaky breath. What am I going to do? Griffin took her hands in his. Do you trust me? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Then marry me. Her eyes widened. What? As your husband, your property would legally become mine as well, including those heirlooms. They couldn't force you back to Boston without challenging me directly. His grip tightened. And I promise you, they don't want that fight. Theodora stared at him, speechless. You would marry me? Just to protect me from them? Not just for that, Griffin admitted, the words coming easier than he'd expected. These past weeks without you, my cabins never felt emptier. I kept thinking about your smile, your voice. How you made that place feel like a home for the first time since I built it. Griffin, she whispered, color rising in her cheeks. I'm not saying I love you, he clarified quickly. That would be presumptuous. But I think I could, given time. And I think you might feel something similar, or you wouldn't have asked for me when trouble came. Theodora's eyes searched his face. This is madness. We barely know each other. I know enough, he said simply. I know you're brave and resourceful. I know you face hardship without complaint. I know you see me, really see me, in a way no one has since before the war. She bit her lower lip. And if you grow to regret such an impulsive decision, I won't. His confidence surprised even himself. But if it eases your mind, we could agree that after a year, if either of us wishes to dissolve the marriage, we will. No questions, no recriminations. Theodora fell silent, considering his proposal. The schoolroom grew darker as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. Finally, she raised her eyes to his. "Yes," she said quietly. "I accept your proposal." Relief and something warmer flooded Griffin's chest. "You're sure?" A smile tugged at her lips. "No, but I'm sure that I trust you more than anyone I've known in a very long time." They were married the next morning by Pastor Millbrook in Silver Creek's small church. The mayor and his wife stood as witnesses, while most of the townsfolk crowded the pews, drawn by the unexpected romance and drama. Griffin wore his only clean shirt and had actually shaved for the occasion. Theodora borrowed a pale blue dress from the mayor's wife, her mother's locket gleaming at her throat. Chamberlain and his colleague arrived at the church just as the ceremony concluded, their expressions darkening as they realized what had transpired. "This is outrageous," Chamberlain sputtered when Griffin and Theodora emerged. A transparent attempt to circumvent the law. "Actually," Griffin replied calmly, "it's a wedding. Customary to offer congratulations." The lawyer's face reddened. "You think this changes anything? A marriage of convenience won't." "I wouldn't finish that sentence if I were you," Griffin interrupted, his voice dropping dangerously. "Questioning the validity of my marriage to Miss Ellis, Mrs. Novak now, might be considered slander in these parts." Several townsfolk murmured agreement, moving to stand supportively behind the newlyweds. Chamberlain looked around at the hard faces of the frontier community and visibly reconsidered his approach. "Mr. Novak," he said stiffly, "regardless of this development, the items in question remain the property of the Ellis estate." Griffin smiled thinly. "And as husband to the legal heir of Edmund Ellis, I now have an interest in ensuring those items remain with their rightful owner, my wife." "This isn't over," Chamberlain warned. "Yes," Theodora spoke up, her hand firmly in Griffin's. "It is. Return to Boston and tell my cousin that his intimidation has failed. I won't be bullied into surrendering what's rightfully mine." The lawyers departed on the afternoon stage, tight-lipped and defeated. The townsfolk celebrated the newlyweds with an impromptu gathering at the hotel, where Mrs. Whitfield had hastily arranged refreshments. Through it all, Griffin remained close to Theodora, protective yet careful not to overwhelm her. As evening approached, an awkward reality descended. They were legally married, but their arrangement had been made for practical purposes. When they finally excused themselves from the celebration, Griffin led Theodora not to his cabin, but to Mrs. Gardner's boarding house. "I've spoken with Mrs. Gardner," he explained as they stood on the porch. "You'll continue to stay here while I make improvements to the cabin. It should be more suitable for a lady in a few weeks." Theodora regarded him with surprise. "You intend to live separately?" "For now," he nodded. "This marriage was made hastily, for your protection. I meant what I said about giving ourselves time." "Most men wouldn't be so considerate," she observed. Griffin shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm not most men." "No," she agreed softly. "You're not." An awkward silence fell between them. Griffin cleared his throat. "I'll call on you tomorrow. Perhaps we could ride out to see the cabin, so you can tell me what changes you'd like." "I'd like that." She hesitated, then rose on tiptoes to press a gentle kiss to his cheek. "Thank you, Griffin, for everything." He nodded, suddenly at a loss for words, and watched as she disappeared inside. Only then did he touch his fingers to the spot her lips had touched, a bemused expression crossing his weathered face. The following weeks established a routine unlike anything Griffin had known before. Each morning, he would ride into town to escort Theodora to the schoolhouse. While she taught, he worked on improving his cabin, adding a second room, building proper furniture, even installing glass windows ordered specially from Helena. In the evenings, they would take supper together at the hotel or with Mayor Whitfield and his wife, gradually growing more comfortable in each other's company. Their conversations deepened, revealing shared values and complementary temperaments. Griffin found himself laughing more than he had in years, while Theodora blossomed under his steady protection. 1 month after their wedding, Griffin arrived at the schoolhouse with news. "The cabin's ready," he announced as Theodora dismissed her students. "If you'd like to see it." She smiled warmly. "I've been curious about these mysterious improvements you've been making." They rode out together, Theodora now comfortable on horseback after weeks of Griffin's patient instruction. As they crested the final ridge, the cabin came into view. transformed from the Spartan bachelor dwelling she remembered into something far more inviting. A covered porch wrapped around two sides. Curtains hung in the new glass windows. A small garden had been started, and a painted sign reading Novak hung beside the door. "Griffin," she breathed. "It's wonderful." He helped her dismount, suddenly nervous. "Wait until you see inside." The interior had been completely reimagined. The main room now held a proper dining table with chairs, comfortable seating near the fireplace, and bookshelves Griffin had crafted himself. The new second room contained a large bed with a colorful quilt, a dressing table, and a wardrobe. "I wasn't sure about the quilt," Griffin admitted as Theodora ran her hand over the intricate stitching. "Mrs. Porter made it as a wedding gift." "It's perfect," she assured him, taking in the thoughtful details throughout the cabin. "You've done all this in a month?" "Wanted it to be right," he said simply. "A proper home." Their eyes met, something shifting in the air between them. Theodora stepped closer, her hand coming to rest on his chest. "When you proposed this arrangement," she said softly, "you mentioned that after a year, either of us could dissolve it without question." Griffin nodded, his throat suddenly dry. "That still stands. What if I don't want to wait a year to make a decision?" His heart sank. "You want to end it already?" "No," she smiled, eyes bright with emotion. "I want to make it real. Now. Today." Griffin stared at her, scarcely daring to believe what she was suggesting. "Theodora, I've fallen in love with you." "Griffin Novak," she stated simply. "I think perhaps I started falling that first night in the storm. Every day since has only confirmed what I already knew, that you are the most honorable, gentle, remarkable man I've ever known." He cupped her face in his calloused hands. "I love you too," he admitted hoarsely. "Have for weeks now. Wasn't sure you felt the same." "Then let me remove all doubt," she whispered, rising to meet his lips with her own. Their first true kiss was tentative at first, then deepened with growing confidence. When they finally pulled apart, both were breathing quickly, years of solitude and caution giving way to something new and precious. "Welcome home, Mrs. Novak," Griffin murmured against her hair. That evening, as stars appeared in the vast Montana sky, Griffin and Theodora sat on their porch, her head resting comfortably against his shoulder. The future stretched before them, not without challenges, but rich with possibility. "I was thinking," Griffin said, breaking a comfortable silence. "Come spring, we might expand the cabin again. Add another room." Theodora smiled up at him. "Planning ahead? A man should think about the future," he replied, his arm tightening around her. "Especially when it's finally worth looking forward to." "I'd like that," she said softly. "A home that grows with us." As darkness settled over the land, Griffin Novak looked at the woman beside him and marveled at how completely his life had changed. He'd rescued a traveler from a storm, never imagining she would save him from a loneliness so profound he'd stopped recognizing it as pain. Now, in this cabin built by his hands but made a home by her presence, he had found something he'd long ago stopped believing existed, a place where past wounds could finally heal, and future joys could take root and flourish. And all because of a spring storm that had washed away everything except what truly mattered.